It's Friday, January 24th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, we are 1 week in to the Trump presidency, and it has been an all-out assault of executive orders from the Oval Office, with Trump signing dozens of them. So today, we'll be talking about some of the most important ones, what they mean, and what the fallout is going to be. My guests today are Liz Dye, back on the show, and this time she brought her co-host from the Law and Chaos podcast, Andrew Torrez. We're going to be talking about some of the things Trump can and can't actually do in these orders. One of them he definitely can't do, and what Trump's already telling us about how he plans to use the office of the presidency to make himself and his friends just a little bit richer. But first, let's get to your headlines. On Monday, the Ohio State Buckeyes beat Notre Dame in the College Football National Championship 34-23. Now, I am a good Wisconsin Badger, and I'm never that happy when Ohio State wins anything at all, but here we are. Now, the game seemed like it was over as they were heading into the fourth quarter. The Buckeyes led 34-7, but Notre Dame had a big comeback that nearly cost Ohio State the title. However, they held off the Fighting Irish to win the school's first national championship since 2014. Now, this year was also the first time the NCAA held a 12-team college football playoff. It garnered huge ratings for all of the games and certainly did so for the championship game, which means the NCAA is likely going to stick to a 12-team playoff this season, despite some controversy about it when they announced it. Also on Monday, the Senate confirmed Marco Rubio to be the next U.S. Secretary of State. Rubio was once a former pretty big critic of Donald Trump and was once a former primary opponent against him in 2016, but now he's the first person officially in Trump's cabinet. And of Trump's cabinet picks, Rubio is comparatively really mainstream. I mean, he's a tenured senator from Florida with a background in foreign policy and on immigration. He's pretty well liked by senators, and that was shown out in his vote for confirmation because he was voted in unanimously. Now, being Trump's Secretary of State will not be an easy job, given Trump's outward disdain for American allies like Mexico and Canada and members of NATO, but also Trump's recent insistence on things like regaining control of the Panama Canal from the country of Panama, which pretty much sounds like he wants to take it by force, as well as somehow buying Greenland from Denmark. I don't know. Not to mention shifting U.S. policy in the war in Ukraine. Needless to say, Rubio will have his work cut out for him. On Tuesday, it was announced that 2 Americans were released after being held captive in Afghanistan. According to several reports, Ryan Corbett and William McKinty were released in a deal struck with the Taliban in the final hours of Joe Biden's presidency. Now, the 2 had been prisoner for more than 2 years and were exchanged for a man named Khan Mohammed, who was serving a life sentence for drug trafficking and terror charges. His sentence was commuted by Biden just before he left office so that this deal could go through. Now, there are still 2 more Americans being held prisoner in Afghanistan right now. They were taken hostage after the botched exit of the Afghan war. But so far, we don't know anything about a deal if that's been struck for those 2. Finally, late this week, wildfires reignited in California, particularly north of Los Angeles, in a third fire that's now known as the Hughes Fire that, at the time that I'm recording this, has burned more than 9,000 acres, being fueled by another kick-up of those 80-mile-an-hour winds. The fire also sparked a new round of evacuations for tens of thousands of residents who have been watching this entire time, hoping that the flames wouldn't reach their town. The other 2 fires, the Palisades Fire and the Eaton Fire, are also still burning. The Eaton Fire has burned about 14,000 acres and is about 91% contained. And the Palisades Fire, the biggest fire so far here, has burned 24,000 acres and is only 2/3 contained, according to SoCal Fire, which is overseeing all of this. And on top of that, California remains in a red flag warning for hurricane force winds as we head into the weekend. If you want to help the victims of the fires and those working right now to fight it, I've got links on how to help those folks in the show notes of this episode. And that is it for your headlines. Let's get to today's episode, Trump's breakneck first week back in office. Within minutes of taking the oath of office, Donald Trump began signing executive orders, and there were dozens of them, with more planned on the way, but really they fall into a few categories. What he wants to do in immigration, retribution through the Justice Department, and remaking the government to serve him. So right away, Trump declared an emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border, claiming that all immigrants of all statuses, so legal or illegal, were invading the U.S. And with that and other orders, he closed the southern border to all crossings, halted the asylum process, and instructed the Department of Defense to begin deploying troops to the southern border, which they said they would send about 1,500 troops to start. What those orders meant was that tens of thousands of immigrants who were already cleared to come into the U.S. weren't allowed to enter. Hundreds of thousands of people who were trying to claim asylum from dangerous places where their lives are at risk could no longer use the specific app you have to use to do that because the app was turned off. The orders also began instructing immigration and customs enforcement officers to immediately deport asylum seekers, regardless of where their cases were in the process, and start patrolling neighborhoods in major, mostly Democratic-controlled cities and states, in neighborhoods where they're looking for people that they suspect are undocumented immigrants. And on top of all of that, the Justice Department understood at least a few of these orders as a way to start telling federal prosecutors to investigate state and local officials who refused to comply with Trump's new immigration orders, and Trump also moved to end birthright citizenship. Now, a lot of this stuff is stuff that he can do. The stuff that he does within departments, giving orders and directives, that's all within the president's power. Things like ending birthright citizenship, he can't do. It's not going to work. It's enshrined in the 14th Amendment, but a little more on that in our conversation with Liz and Andrew. The Trump administration is claiming these things are all campaign promises kept, and to a certain extent, they are on paper at least. But what's happening in the real world is that they're causing a lot of fear in immigrant communities, especially in schools and hospitals, which are now apparently on the table for immigration raids when they didn't used to be before because of the harm that it could do to children and the vulnerable in those places. These orders have also sent shockwaves through the business community, especially the food industry, where the people who pick our food and pack our meat are mostly immigrants. And I'm saying immigrants here and not just undocumented immigrants on purpose, because these orders aren't that targeted, meaning they will undoubtedly end up harming people or catching people who are here legally or are American citizens. And yes, those cases will go through the courts, and you hope that at the end of those things, the right thing is done. But given the sheer number of people that these orders are actually targeting in general, those cases will take a long time and will upend lives and separate families and generally cause quite a bit of chaos. The next big set of executive orders were shots not just across the bow of law, but right at it. Trump ordered the investigation of dozens of former intelligence officials who initially signed a letter back in 2020 saying the Hunter Biden laptop was a clear Russian spy operation. Now, there are still hallmarks of that in this case or in this saga. And while the laptop was verified to be Hunter Biden's, the whole story and the way that it played out still has a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of holes. This is also something that Republicans in Congress tried to get to the bottom of. They investigated it, and they weren't able to find any concrete evidence that something untoward happened, but Trump wants to target these people again anyway, just to target them. But the most important order, and I think maybe the most consequential of all of his orders, and maybe doesn't outrank other ones, but there certainly isn't one that's higher than this, was the blanket pardoning of 1,500 January 6th rioters, people who were both convicted and accused of being there that day, including people who led the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, two militant groups who were caught on tape plotting the attack at the Capitol. It included attackers who harmed police officers and threatened elected officials and committed other violent crimes. It even covered people who have already pleaded guilty and then said when they pleaded guilty that when they entered the Capitol, they knew it was wrong when they did it. Now, the reason I think this is a really important order to watch is because it shows how Trump will approach the law for the next 4 years, that he sees it as a tool to serve him, not as presidents generally see it, which is a constraint on their power or something designed to uphold American values. It gives us the clearest look right now into how Trump is approaching the powers of the presidency this time he's in the Oval Office. And according to Axios, there was some internal debate about whether Trump should only pardon people who were convicted or accused of nonviolent crimes, or if he should just do a blanket pardon like he did. And according to this source that talked to Axios, Trump said, quote, "F it, release them all." Now, among Republicans, there have been two different responses. Some, like Speaker Mike Johnson, have refused to answer if they support Trump pardoning people who attacked officers and went after members of Congress, despite being the party of Back the Blue and Law and Order. Instead, folks like Johnson are saying that they're looking forward while also supporting Trump's order to go back and target people from a letter from 5 years ago, and also supporting a House investigation into the January 6th committee, which wrapped up more than 2 years ago. But I digress. There are ones who aren't happy about this because it undermines them, like Senator Tom Tillis, who said this to CNN.
We're going through it now. Many of them probably was the right thing to do. They made a bad choice. But anybody who was convicted of assault on a police officer, I can't get there at all. I think it was a bad idea.
There's also been a lot of backlash from law enforcement about this. The Fraternal Order of Police and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, two very conservative groups that endorsed Trump, signed a joint letter saying they were deeply discouraged by the pardons and that if people who commit crimes, especially against police officers, aren't held accountable and the punishments aren't severe, it sends a dangerous message that could lead to more violence. And here's what the chief of Capitol Police said to CBS just after the pardons went out.
Does that send?
Well, I think it sends the message that politics is more important than policing. And my officers go out there every day and enforce the law impartially.
If violent criminals are pardoned, does that put law enforcement officers in danger in the future?
It could put any of our communities in danger. Anybody that is convicted of a violent crime and then allowed to not serve their sentence or just be let off the hook, I think it has an impact on our communities nationwide.
It is important to know here that the pardons are fully within Trump's power to grant. What will be interesting to see is what happens next if these law enforcement groups drop support or lessen support for Trump, or if more likely what will happen is they'll just go along with someone who didn't see a problem with making their lives harder. But it will still be interesting to see how people react to this. Now, finally, there's one chunk of these orders that has gotten a lot of important attention, but it's also been missing a piece. These are the orders about federal employees and the federal government. So earlier this week, Trump ordered the firing or the putting on leave of any and all employees who worked in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility offices. You'll hear them called DEI or DEIA offices, under the guise of saying that these offices undermined civil rights and the general idea of meritocracy. And we're talking about thousands of people who had jobs on Monday morning under Joe Biden and then didn't have jobs just less than 24 hours later under Donald Trump. He also signed an order to end DEI programs in government agencies, and the new administration said that in line with that order, they want federal employees to snitch on one another if they see someone in their department or in their agency working toward what they think is a diversity, equity, and inclusivity-oriented goal, which means that a lot of workplaces, and the federal government employs the most people of any agency or company in the country, it made a lot of those workplaces a lot more hostile. Now, outside of the DEI orders, Trump did move to create Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. He did that by actually just renaming the USDS, the U.S. Department of Digital Service, which is a tiny department of something like 230 people that operates out of the federal IT department. Basically, what USDS, or DOGE now, I guess, does is just makes things digital in slow, more analog agencies. They tout their success with moving things digitally at the VA and the Social Security Administration. It also has a tiny budget compared to other departments. It got $200 million from the American Rescue Plan, 4 years ago, and then just this past year was asking for another $30 million to help keep things running. And to put that in perspective, Elon Musk is worth $400 billion. $230 million is just over 0.5% of Musk's wealth. So it's so small, it's hard to fathom that he would even care about something like this. But it's also unclear if there's even enough money there to do a lot of the work that Musk and Trump want to do with this department. It's just so small. Now, Trump also signed an executive order to get federal employees to come back into the office to work, even though there have been studies that have shown that government employees who were often criticized for being inefficient were actually more productive when they worked at home. And then last on his list here of remaking the government, he ordered a hiring freeze on civilian jobs, except those that would affect national security, meaning jobs that were held open until a new administration came in can now not be filled. And all of this is about, like I said, remaking the government in Trump's new sweeping vision to bend the work of government to his whim, which is not really how presidents have approached a lot of these things, because the vast majority of the people affected by this aren't political employees. They're civil servants. They're people who do jobs that just make things run. And these orders have been seen as roadblocks to that. So much so that several employee groups have already filed lawsuits against the Department of Government Efficiency and the Trump administration. But just like those immigration things I said before, those will take time to work through the courts. And in the meantime, workers and their families are going to be affected. And it's here that I want to take a quick step back, because there is one thing that all of these things have in common. All these different kinds of orders that I just talked about show that the people Trump has around him this time, they are way more organized. They clearly spent the last 4 years getting these plans together, getting the right people in place, and figuring out how to execute them, at least to this part of the process. So when you hear about more orders and more plans, and there are more expected to be coming, it's worth paying attention to not just what these orders say and what they do, but also how they're rolled out, because that matters too. And speaking of what matters and what doesn't, that is part of my discussion today with Liz Dye and Andrew Torrez, the hosts of the Law and Chaos podcast. They were gracious enough to spend some time with me talking about this flurry of executive orders in what has been a jam-packed week. We talk about what Trump can and can't actually do with these orders, and how to follow the money here when it comes to what he's signing in the Oval Office. I think before we dive into the specifics of the executive order, specifically when it comes to defining gender in the U.S. on birthright citizenship, and then we'll talk about a TikTok ban here, I'm curious to learn about how you guys are thinking about just how much of these executive orders are going to work, and your thoughts about just this flurry of these things. Andrew, you're new here. Why don't you start?
Thanks for having me. Let's put this into context, right? Trump issued 26 executive orders on day one in office. That is the most in history. The second most was Biden with 9. The third most was Obama with 2. The fourth most was two presidents, Trump's first term and Clinton with one, and then every other president is in a 40-way tie with zero, right? So one of the things that, those of us on the left told ourselves, in consolation after the election in November was, hey, this is the gang that can't shoot straight. This is the guy who has Alina Habba as his lawyer. Like, they're incompetent morons and he's lazy. And like, all of that can be true, but he's got an army of sycophants who are competent. They're evil, but they're competent, and they worked their butts off in November and December, and they came prepared, and that's a little terrifying.
Well, and I think that they were prepared before that, right? We all saw Project 2025. It was thousands of pages, and it was thousands of pages that said exactly what they did here. In down to the detail, right? In granular detail, they had these EOs ready to go. They had people that they wanted to hire, thousands of them ready to go. So, they were certainly the first time the gang that couldn't shoot straight. You were certainly the first time around you had Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller kind of going in the back room and home brewing up these wildly illegal executive orders that didn't accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And I'm not saying that these orders are great. There's certainly glaring holes in all of them, but they're not anything like what that happened the first time. We certainly aren't going to be able to count on incompetence to save us in the way that it did the last time.
Right. If they were the gang that couldn't shoot straight in 2017, in the last 4 years, they got prescription glasses. Right.
That's a good analogy.
Right. So let's talk about the executive order about two genders, the defining man and woman in the way that it did. I've seen quite a few things about how it actually ends up defining everybody as a woman because of the way that it's written.
Right.
Yeah, Liz, go ahead.
I mean, so in theory, what they say is that it's basically from conception, you're the one with the big gamete or the little gamete or whatever. But at conception, there isn't this. I'm not a biologist, but the point was that from conception, there is all babies are kind of at conception female, sort of phenotypically, or phenotypically would be the wrong word because, again, not a biologist, but that sexual differentiation takes several weeks. And so what they said is basically everybody's either a female or a trans man. It's silly, and that's clearly not going to save us, but it is an example. It is a good example of how, how poorly they thought this through. And how it's impossible to define genders. Like they joke that you don't even know what a woman is. This is the gotcha question in all of these hearings to people who worked for the Biden administration. Like, what is a woman? And they didn't do such a hot job themselves when they tried to make a really simple definition.
Well, and factually on that point, saying sex shall refer to an individual's immutable biological classification. I mean, it's just wrong as a matter of science. But I think from my perspective, this really highlights the way that we want to take a look at these executive orders, right? Because they come in multiple components, and all of them begin with a purposive statement or instruction to executive branch agencies as to how to interpret the law. And that's often the most incendiary portions of these EOs. It's the part that gets a lot of press attention, right? It's the part that, here is sort of very stupidly written. But then it transitions into, and this, backstops the point that Liz was making earlier, right? These look like normal EOs, right? The content is absolutely crazy, but in form, they look like a normal thing that a normal president would issue. And one of the things that a president can do via executive order is the president is the head of the executive branch. They can tell executive branch agencies what to do. So yes, on the one hand, right, you can point and laugh, and we should, at their utter lack of understanding of science to drive their hatred in the purposive statement. But what this is going to do, right, the practical upshot of this order are instructions to executive branch agencies to develop and promulgate rules that are consistent with those instructions, right? And everybody who's getting this, right? Like, HHS is not going to develop policies consistent with defining everyone as a woman, right? They know what this order is meant to do. It's meant to kick trans people out of public life. And they're going to develop internal rules and then promulgate external rules subject to the Administrative Procedures Act that will try to effectuate that. Like, that's the harm.
The thing that, when I'm thinking about these things, is that inside these agencies, and this is also sort of part of the thing that listeners will have just heard about getting rid of certain kinds of employees. It's the Project 2025 Schedule F stuff that I've talked about in past episodes and past writings, is that there are parts of these agencies that will have to be completely overhauled, and that will take time and it will be expensive because of the way that these executive orders are written. But these will also go through the courts. So when it comes to something like this, is there a version of this that I am not even sure what kind of group would sue over this, but that it could end up in the court system like this? I'm not aware of a lawsuit against this specific executive order yet, but that could just be, because there's so many. I don't know.
Well, so certainly. So the part of this executive order instructs the Attorney General and all of the Justice Department agencies to, for instance, force trans prisoners to aid detransition and to move trans women into all men's prisons, right? So there will clearly be many people who have standing to challenge this, because there will be people who are endangered by being forcibly detransitioned and to have their medical care taken from them, and B, they'll be, placed in grave danger. This violates. So the way that the rubber is going to meet the road here with that specific provision is that there is a law that was passed by Congress in 2003 called the Prison Rape Elimination Act, the PREA, and the government sort of spent a long time studying and promulgating regulations. Remember, regulations are the way that the government implements the law. They are not actually law. So there are a whole bunch of regulations that talk about how to deal with trans prisoners, how to kind of protect them. And while they don't specifically, or they're about to be rescinded, so perhaps we should speak about them in the past tense. While they don't specifically say you must house trans women in women's prisons, they oblige prisons to make an individualized safety determination that takes into account sexual orientation, gender orientation, kind of gender dysmorphia, all kinds of other things that the government, that Donald Trump has just declared by executive fiat don't exist, by saying there's only two genders and they're immutable and unchangeable, and that's what God ordained. And so there will be lawsuits under this. And in fact, not only does the PRA is a law, PREA does create substantive rights. And there are states which have entered into consent decrees under the PREA, which will be violated by this implementation. And so there's going to be a lot of litigation on that kind of immediately, because they're going to take these women out of women's prisons and put them into men's prisons, where they're in grave danger of being sexually assaulted and raped and victimized in all kinds of horrendous ways. I mean, look, it doesn't bear, it's not that I need to tell anybody this, but let us be clear. The intent of this law, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, is to stop this epidemic of prison rape. And under the guise of defending women, which is the heading of this executive order, they're going to make sure that a lot of trans women get raped, right? It's such an appalling Orwellian situation.
I want to move on to the birthright citizenship executive order here, because when you read it, they start by, repudiating Dred Scott, which they should. But then it's also sort of like, hey, this was bad, but... And so, I thought it was weird that they included that at all, but there's just no way that this is going to work, Liz, right?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to kind of spot the slippage before we go anywhere else, right? Because there's the legal slippage, and there's the when the rubber meets the road slippage, and it's going to be kind of pretty egregious in both contexts. But I think it makes sense. Maybe I'll read the wording of the 14th Amendment and we can talk about why it's wrong. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and that's the key words, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Okay? So here's what they say in the executive order. The 14th Amendment has never been interpreted to extend citizenship universally to everyone born within the United States. The 14th Amendment has always excluded from birthright citizenship persons who were born in the United States but not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Okay, so that's a lie. I mean, there's no other way to put it, right? The way that courts have interpreted this, and there's a very famous case called Wong Kim Ark, which everybody in law school learns, which says, basically, if you were born here and your parents were subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, the way that the Trump administration has kind of fudged this is to say, well, subject to the jurisdiction thereof means that you were a U.S. subject. That's not true. Courts have consistently said if the government can lock you up, right? If you steal a candy bar from 7-Eleven and the government can arrest you for shoplifting, you are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. It does not mean that you are a U.S. subject. We don't have subjects because we're theoretically a democracy, or we were for, until last week. Anyway, the point is that's the slippage, is that the Trump administration has pretended, they've just said, well, subject to the jurisdiction thereof means that you're here legally or you're a citizen. And that's not true. There are two very specific exceptions that have been throughout history. One is consular immunity, right? So if, we've all heard about diplomats who, rear end somebody and can't be arrested or can't be sued or whatever. Consular immunity and children of invading armies. And before Trump was elected, and perhaps now we're going to see some more of this, the government, particularly Texas Governor Greg Abbott, said these people who are illegal border crossers are a hostile invading army, and so we don't have to obey federal immigration law. And we're probably going to see that. You've already seen Trump define undocumented border crossers or even asylum seekers as a hostile.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. He does that in several executive orders.
Right. But here, I really think it's very important because when I've written or spoken about this before, I've gotten a lot of pushback from people who are sort of ignorant, and God knows John Eastman, the curious professor, he's been flogging this theory of subject to the jurisdiction thereof does not mean, just here. But that's where they're I mean, that's just a lie. There's 100 years of Supreme Court precedent that says otherwise. They're just lying.
No, I was going to say, not that this is a Supreme Court that's cared a whole lot in recent years about precedent, right? I mean, this is...
It's true, and that's one of Liz and my hobby horses, is that this Supreme Court is essentially rewriting everything on a blank slate. This would be a monumental change to overrule Wong Kim Ark. And Liz described the two exceptions that survive into the modern day, but one of the analyses that doesn't, because of statutory changes with respect to tribal lands, involves Native Americans, right? Like that was sort of the third category. Wong Kim Ark is an 1898 case, right? So we're talking about a foundational precedent for more than a century, and B, what the Supreme Court essentially wrestled with at the time was that there was and some aspects survive today, this concept of sovereignty within sovereignty as it pertains to Native peoples. And so you can see, right, like if you are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, in that if you commit a crime, you will be tried by tribal courts rather than U.S. courts, that's perfectly consistent. And so when I think about what sort of precedent is likely to survive, I share your fears that this is a court that thinks about the outcome first and, how to reach it second, if at all.
But let's move on to the TikTok ban and really the ban, not the ban itself, even though it seems pretty clear that TikTok and Trump's ban are outside of the law. I mean, an executive order can't overrule a law.
Right.
So right now, if I'm using TikTok, like I did this morning because it's up and running, am I currently breaking the law as not real legal advice? But
no. And let's be clear, it's up and running, but as of today, you can't download it Right? If you will not be able to upload it, you will not be able to make in-app purchases, and that's where the rubber meets the road. It's not illegal for you to do it. I think it's called the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversaries Act or something like that. It's called PFACA is the acronym, and what's happened now is that it penalizes the app stores or providers if they allow it to come into your house, right? Or if they supply it to you. So where we are now is that Oracle and Akamai, the web servers, have taken the Trump administration at its word that they will not be prosecuted, and or not prosecuted, but they will not have civil liability. And the civil liability is high. It is $5,000 per user, and there are 170 million TikTok users in this country alone. So in theory, there could be tremendous liability, right, for these providers. Google and Apple have not. So as of right now, Google and Apple will not let you download TikTok, and it will not update TikTok for you. And you, as I said, you can't make in-app purchases. This is a really complicated one, right? Because this was a law that went into effect, and Trump is saying that he's going to abrogate a duly enacted law, or at least refuse to enforce it. And interestingly, during the Biden administration, a lot of conservatives sued Biden all the time and said that he failed to enforce the law. And so there were all of these kind of Fifth Circuit, mainly from the Fifth Circuit, but also from the 11th Circuit, rulings that said basically, you must enforce the law. You, the Biden administration, are totally lawless. Trump is talking about the U.S. government will buy a 50% stake in TikTok, which is crazy, or that the U.S. government would get a 50% stake, in conjunction with, whichever oligarch wants to buy it, possibly Elon Musk, or Larry Ellison from Oracle. I've seen reporting that Mr. Beast is part of a contingent that's going to make a bid.
Good.
No.
Good.
No, but it's not illegal for you to use TikTok. It would be unlawful under the statute as currently worded for someone to let you have a new copy of TikTok.
Right. But what this is really about is about the way that Trump views business and views all these things as ways to make himself and all of those men who were sitting in the very front row of his inauguration just a little bit richer over his presidency. Andrew?
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Liz said to say, the reason why Google and Apple maybe are slightly less sanguine about just violating the law on the promise that the Department of Justice will take no action against you. And in that 70, because what the executive order says is, I want a 75-day pause, and I'm going to instruct the Department of Justice not to prosecute anyone within that 75-day period. And okay, you can kind of do that, even though the statute says that the Attorney General shall prosecute cases where there's evidence of violation. But it includes the standard language at the bottom of the executive order. And this is the downside of making your EOs match, real law, real executive orders, that says this order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, under the laws. So in other words, if you forbear, right, if you are Google or Apple and you violate the law by distributing, maintaining, or updating, that's the language from the statute, TikTok, which is also defined in the statute of limitations on that is 5 years. I would like to think that Donald Trump will only be in office for 4 years, hopefully less. And so, you could not go into court in 2030 and say, Your Honor, there was an executive order. It said we were home free in those 75 days, right? The judge is going to say, yeah, right. But did you read the bottom? It says no substantive right created. You knew you were violating the law.
Can I push back on something that you just said there, Grant? Because you said that this is about kind of enriching all of his oligarchical buddies. And I would 100% agree with you. It is. And look, it hasn't been kind of reported widely, but as a person who receives the White House communications, they're pushing to Truth Social. They're saying, please read this announcement at Truth Social, right? That's obviously using the power of the federal government to enrich himself by, making his own tech platform essential reading, as gummy and buggy as it is. But I think part of what I want to push back on here is the way that it kind of highlights the fact that Trump, right? So Trump in 2020 issued his own executive order saying that TikTok presented this danger because of Chinese manipulation, right? And then because we have this kind of feckless political classes, they all shouted, national security, China is dangerous. And because it became this kind of exercise in competitive China bashing, they passed this poorly thought out statute, which very clearly violates the First Amendment, or at least in my opinion, but no, since the D.C. Circuit said it doesn't violate the First Amendment, and apparently now so did the Supreme Court because they allowed the ban to go into effect. I think what's happened here is it's a signal of how completely captured our politicians are by this need to bash China in a not particularly useful way. And right, when Trump said, what about your about face? And he said, well, I became a really big star on TikTok. And he said, if they're exfiltrating user data, it's mostly young people and they don't have anything interesting to exfiltrate. Right. So of all the things that this does, I agree with you. It highlights his totally oligarchical transactional nature, but it also highlights the way that the justifications he throws out are completely made up, right? He says it's an emergency. We have to do this really important thing. I mean, the reason that he said that was what happened is in June of 2020, he held this rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And what happened is that there was a prank which was organized on TikTok for people to go and reserve large blocks of seats, and then not show up, which resulted in there being this visual of all of these empty seats at his rally, and that was why he wanted to ban TikTok. I mean, I think it's clearly an effort to enrich his buddies, but it's also just a gross illustration of how he'll just make up any justification for any law that he wants.
Right. And I think that is the thing with all of these executive orders,
Exactly.
too, is that there is also this underlying current of not just what they say and how the rubber meets the road, but also the tone and the message it's sending in between the lines. Thank you both for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
A big thanks to Liz and Andrew for coming on the show. You can find a link to the Law and Chaos podcast and Substack in the show notes, and you really should check it out if you haven't already. And that is it for today's show. Please rate and review the podcast on whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new episodes or new videos. Also, subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where this weekend I'll have not one, but 2 extended interviews up. I'll have the extended interview with Liz and Andrew up tomorrow. And on Sunday, I'll be putting up the extended interview from this week's midweek episode with Deepti Doshi from the Free Our Feeds social media movement, creating a billionaire-free social media platform. If you thought that shorter version of the interview was interesting, the longer one is just as good. And as always, share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X or Twitter and on Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.